Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing the world has grown strangely quiet, not because there is less noise, but because almost no one questions it anymore. The voices around you move fast, loud, and certain, yet beneath that surface confidence, something essential has vanished. The pause, the hesitation, the sacred moment of asking, but is this really true? When critical thinking fades, society doesn't collapse with a roar. It sinks silently, like a ship sliding beneath the waves. What remains is not a world of ignorance, but a culture where certainty is borrowed, where opinions are recycled, where the fire of individual thought is exchanged for the comfort of belonging. Carl Jung once warned that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own soul. And when entire societies avoid that confrontation, what rises is not wisdom, but what might be called a trance, a collective state where human beings surrender their inner vision for the approval of the crowd. This is the hidden story of our age. Not the endless stream of data, not the speed of our machines, but the slow starvation of wisdom. In this journey, we will uncover why critical thinking has been quietly exiled from our lives, how systems and habits have been built to keep us distracted, and what it truly means to reclaim the power of your own mind. Because the most dangerous form of stupidity is not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to think for yourself. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Thinking is hard. And in today's world, it is not just hard. It is actively discouraged. Modern life does not reward depth. It rewards speed. It rewards outrage. It rewards conformity. The system prizes the quick reaction over the careful reflection, the soundbite over the conversation, the certainty of belonging over the discomfort of doubt. And because of that, millions unconsciously learn to substitute noise for understanding. This isn't random. It is designed. Algorithms tailor your feeds to echo what you already believe. Education drills you to memorize, not to wonder. Workplaces quietly punish dissent more than incompetence. And socially, we are taught that silence is safer than disagreement. All of this conditions us to avoid the friction of real thought. Noam Chomsky, analyzing propaganda decades ago, called this the manufacturing of consent. When people consume without questioning, agree without understanding, they become manageable, predictable, docile. And so what was once considered a birthright skill, the capacity to think critically, is now treated as an inconvenience. Critical thinking slows down the debate. It complicates the narrative. It dares to whisper, but is this really true? And in a culture that worships being right, even asking that question has become dangerous. But why does this matter? Because when we abandon the discipline of thinking, we don't fall into freedom. We fall into conditioning. We begin to accept what we're told, to adopt the slogans of our group, to perform certainty instead of pursuing truth. And in that process, we surrender one of the deepest forms of human freedom, the right to form our own judgment. This is why even the most intelligent among us fall into the trap. The culture rewards certainty and punishes hesitation, but wisdom is born only in that hesitation, in the pause before reaction, in the moment where you dare to think. So the real question is, how did we arrive in a world that trains us not to think? To answer that, we need to look at how the human brain itself reacts when it is overwhelmed with too much to process. The modern human brain is drowning. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin estimates that the average person now processes several times more information each day than people did only a few decades ago. Every hour, we are bombarded with breaking news, notifications, ads, texts, videos, and opinions. This flood doesn't just compete for our attention, it reshapes how we think. Our minds were never designed for this pace. The brain, when overwhelmed, begins to conserve energy. It shortcuts. It reaches for quick judgments instead of careful reasoning. It leans on rules of thumb and unconscious biases to navigate the chaos. And those shortcuts are precisely what modern systems exploit. Consider social proof. When you see a post with thousands of likes and shares, a part of you assumes it must be valuable or true. That's not reason speaking. It is a psychological reflex, a survival strategy from our evolutionary past when following the tribe meant staying alive. But today, this reflex is hijacked. Popularity is mistaken for truth. Engagement is mistaken for evidence. And the crowd becomes a substitute for your own discernment. The same is true with attention. Psychologist Marianne Wolf has shown that digital skimming rewires our neural pathways. We grow restless, distracted, impatient with long arguments. Our attention fractures into fragments. But critical thinking requires sustained attention. It requires sitting with an idea, turning it over, questioning it from multiple angles. Ask yourself, when was the last time you read a full article without checking your phone? When was the last time you let a question echo in your mind before rushing to answer it? These habits, once ordinary, are now vanishing. And this is not just a matter of convenience. It is a matter of control. Because the more fractured our attention becomes, the easier it is to steer our minds. If you cannot hold focus, you cannot hold judgment. If you cannot pause to think, you cannot resist being told what to think. Carl Sagan once warned that we live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology. Yet, hardly anyone understands either. His concern was not ignorance itself, but the loss of critical thought in a world ruled by systems too complex to question casually. So ask yourself honestly, in the flood of voices around you, how often are you thinking? And how often are you simply reacting? Because the more our thinking is outsourced to cues, trends, and algorithms, the less we notice that we are drifting, not toward wisdom, but toward what Jung calls a collective unconscious. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. To understand how we reach this point, we need to step back to where thinking first begins, childhood. What if the very institutions that claim to nurture our minds were quietly teaching us not how to think, but how to obey? The award-winning teacher and critic John Taylor Gatto argued that modern education was never designed to create independent thinkers. It was born during the industrial age to produce workers who would be predictable, efficient, and compliant. In his words, schools don't really teach anything except how to obey orders. Think about your earliest memories of school. Were you rewarded for asking the question that challenged the lesson plan? Or were you rewarded for memorizing the answer that fit the test? From the very beginning, conformity is praised, while curiosity is often treated as disruption. And over time, the lesson becomes clear. Follow the rules. Color inside the lines. Repeat what you are told. The student who questions too much is labeled difficult. The one who absorbs and repeats is celebrated as bright. But the pattern doesn't end in childhood. It carries into adult life. In the workplace, employees who rock the boat are branded uncooperative. In media, voices that challenge consensus are dismissed as controversial. Even in friendships, many learn to silence doubts just to belong. And slowly, silence becomes second nature. The fear of exclusion outweighs the pull of truth. We discover that it is easier to stay quiet, to nod along, to avoid the risk of standing alone. The psychologist Erich Fromm observed this in his book, Escape from Freedom. He noted that many people secretly prefer to surrender their freedom of thought. Because freedom brings responsibility, and responsibility can be terrifying. To think for yourself means you can no longer blame the crowd for your ignorance. You can no longer hide behind tradition or ideology. You must bear the burden of truth alone. So instead, we choose comfort. We choose distraction. We choose to believe what everyone else believes, not because it is true, but because it feels safe. This is why education, media, and social life so often discourage critical thought. Because true thinking destabilizes the very systems that rely on compliance. But here lies the paradox. Every time you suppress your own questions, you may win acceptance from others, but you lose something far greater. The clarity and self-respect that only comes from owning your mind. If school was where we first learned obedience, media is where that lesson is perfected. Every platform you use, social media, streaming, even the news, is not neutral. It is designed with a purpose, to capture your attention and keep it. And in that race for attention, truth becomes less important than engagement. Marshall McLuhan warned us decades ago. The medium is the message. He meant that the way information is delivered changes how we think about it. And today's mediums, scroll feeds, short clips, endless notifications are not designed for reflection. They are designed for reaction. Think of the way you consume information now compared to even 10 years ago. Long-form discussions feel slow. Patience feels like a luxury. What thrives instead? Quick outrage, instant certainty, the illusion of knowing without the effort of understanding. This is not just a cultural shift. It is a neurological one. The constant ping of updates keeps the brain in a state of alertness, flooding it with dopamine, rewiring it to crave novelty instead of depth. And here lies the trap. The faster the medium, the shallower the thought. The shallower the thought, the easier it is to manipulate. Because when you are reacting instead of reflecting, you don't notice who is pulling the strings. Algorithms thrive on this. They don't reward nuance. They reward division, speed, and emotional intensity. A measured reflection earns little engagement. A heated argument earns thousands of clicks. And so the system nudges you, not toward truth, but toward performance. Not toward understanding, but toward identity wars, where shouting becomes more valuable than listening. In this environment, even truth itself becomes distorted. What is true is no longer defined by evidence, but by virality. A statement repeated enough times begins to feel credible, not because it is right, but because it is familiar. This is the cognitive tyranny of the majority, not political, but psychological. Ideas win not because they are sound, but because they are loud. And in that loudness, the quiet act of thinking is drowned out. Despite all our faith in logic, the truth is unsettling. The human brain is far more emotional than rational. Daniel Kahneman described this in his book, Thinking, Fast and Slow. He revealed that our minds operate on two tracks. One is fast, instinctive, automatic. The other is slow, deliberate, analytical. The fast system is a survival gift. It lets us act quickly in danger. But it also jumps to conclusions, clings to shortcuts, and mistakes feeling for truth. The slow system is where real thinking lives. It questions, it weighs, it asks, but what if I'm wrong? But it requires effort, precious mental energy that many of us, already exhausted, are unwilling to spend. And so, in a high-speed culture, most people are locked into fast mode. We react instead of reflect. We confirm instead of question. We cling to what feels right instead of testing what is right. This is fertile soil for manipulation. Marketers, politicians, and media outlets know how to package complexity into simple binaries. Us versus them, good versus bad, hero versus villain. The moment you accept the frame, your slow thinking shuts down. Even more dangerous is confirmation bias. the brain's tendency to defend what it already believes. Once you have accepted an idea as true, your mind begins searching for evidence to prove it right, while ignoring everything that challenges it. Ask yourself, when was the last time you truly sought out evidence that contradicted your beliefs? When was the last time you listened to an opposing view without secretly preparing your counter-argument? If you are honest, probably not often. And that's not weakness, it is human nature. But when we remain unaware of this bias, we become prisoners of our own certainty. Now add one more layer: groupthink. Irving Janis, who studied this phenomenon, showed how even intelligent groups make catastrophic decisions when their members silence doubt for the sake of harmony. Challenging the group feels unsafe. Disagreeing risks exclusion. So people trade truth for belonging. They choose the warmth of consensus over the cold solitude of clarity. History is full of examples. Disasters, wars, and atrocities were not always driven by ignorance, but by groups of capable people who knew something was wrong, yet choose silence. Why? Because the courage to dissent requires more than intelligence. It requires integrity. It requires the willingness to stand apart. And here is the irony. Progress has always depended on those rare individuals who refuse to surrender to the comfort of groupthink. Galileo, Darwin, Martin Luther King Jr. They were ridiculed, condemned, even threatened. But they thought anyway. They spoke anyway. To think critically in a society that punishes doubt is an act of quiet rebellion. And though it may cost you approval, it grants something far more valuable: clarity, self-respect, and the rare power of knowing your beliefs are yours, not programmed into you. Up until now, we have seen how schools, media, and even the architecture of the brain itself can trap us in unthinking patterns. But to understand the deepest root of this crisis, we must turn inward, into the human psyche. Carl Jung warned that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own souls. This wasn't a casual observation, it was a diagnosis. Because to face yourself honestly is to confront the illusions that keep you safe. And here lies the most insidious danger of all. We confuse our identity with our ideas. Think of how people speak today. I am my political party. I am my ideology. I am my group, my religion, my affiliation. To question the idea is now seen as an attack on the person. And so dialogue collapses into defense. Reflection collapses into outrage. Curiosity collapses into war. This fusion of identity with belief is what Jung might call a shadow problem. When you cling too tightly to a persona, a mask of certainty, you project everything threatening onto the other. Your shadow, the part of you that holds your doubts and contradictions, gets buried deeper and deeper. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It returns as hostility toward others, as contempt for opposing views, as the desperate need to silence anything that shakes your fragile certainty. And this, more than any algorithm, is what fuels the collective trance of our age. We are terrified not of being wrong about the world, but of being wrong about ourselves. Individuation, the process Jung saw as the true path of human growth, requires something radical. It asks you to separate who you are from what you currently believe. To say, I am not my opinion, I am not my tribe, I am not my mask of certainty. Only then can real thinking begin. Because if your worth is tied to your beliefs, you will defend them to the death. But if your worth is deeper than your beliefs, you can let them go, revise them, and grow. This is why Jung called the process of individuation both liberating and terrifying. To step outside the collective trance is to risk exile from the crowd. It is to stand alone with your soul and to realize that most of what you once called truth was simply inheritance, habit, or fear. But here lies the paradox. What feels like loss is actually freedom. When you detach your identity from your current ideas, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself. You gain the ability to listen without fear, to question without collapsing, to explore without the need for approval. And that ability is the essence of critical thinking. It is not just an intellectual skill. It is a spiritual act. It is the act of honoring truth over comfort, growth over certainty, freedom over conformity. If reclaiming your mind is a moral responsibility, the question becomes, how? How do we resist the trance in a world designed to keep us asleep? The answer is not found in grand revolutions. It begins in small, deliberate practices, habits that protect the inner space where thought can grow. The first is awareness. Awareness of when you are reacting instead of reflecting. Awareness of when you are scrolling, not searching. Awareness of how your emotions are being pulled by language designed to bypass reason. This is the practice of metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Ask yourself in the heat of a moment, why do I believe this? What's influencing me right now, evidence or emotion? Am I engaging with this idea or just absorbing it passively? Even a 5-second pause to notice your own thought patterns is an act of quiet rebellion. The second practice is dialectical thinking, the ability to hold two opposing ideas in tension without rushing to choose sides. It is not weakness. It is strength. It trains the mind to resist binaries, to see complexity where others see only slogans. It is the discipline of saying, both may contain truth, and my task is to explore it. The third practice is deep reading. Not headlines, not feeds, not summaries, but full arguments, entire books, nuanced thought. Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf calls this cognitive patience, the capacity to stay with a text long enough for your brain to wrestle with its depth. Without deep reading, critical thinking starves. With it, the mind stretches, discovers nuance, and builds the stamina needed to resist manipulation. The fourth practice is humility. To think critically is to accept uncertainty, to admit, with Socrates, that the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. Humility disarms arrogance, invites dialogue, and keeps the door to learning open. And finally, the practice of silence. Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, "To understand the immeasurable, the mind must be extraordinarily quiet, still." In a culture addicted to noise, silence becomes a radical teacher. It allows us to listen, not just to others, but to the truth emerging from within. These practices are not glamorous. They won't trend, but they are the quiet architecture of a free mind. We have arrived at the end of this journey. But in truth, the real journey begins here, inside you. Because the disappearance of critical thinking is not just a cultural problem. It is a personal test. A test of whether you will choose the comfort of borrowed certainty or the solitude of genuine thought. The rise of what we called collective stupidity is not caused by ignorance alone. It is born of fear, fear of standing apart, fear of being wrong, fear of facing the shadow within. But every act of clear thinking pushes back against that tide. Every pause before reaction, every question asked in place of an assumption, every moment of silence in a world that demands noise. This is how revolutions truly begin, not with slogans, not with mobs, but with single human beings reclaiming the dignity of their own minds. And make no mistake, this choice is revolutionary, because when you think for yourself, you become harder to manipulate. You see through illusions that others accept as reality. You begin to notice the strings that pull the crowd, and you quietly cut them from your own life. That act of freedom is contagious. It inspires others, not through argument, but through presence. A thinker in a crowd of reactors becomes like a still flame in a storm. Small, perhaps, but impossible to ignore. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But if you dare to face your own, to question the beliefs you cling to examine the motives that guide you, then you begin to live not as a product of your culture, but as the architect of your mind." And that is the essence of individuation. To become whole by stepping outside the collective trance. So I leave you with this question. What idea are you most afraid to question? And what would happen if you dared to? If this message has stirred something in you, don't let it fade back into the noise. Share your reflections in the comments. Not because agreement matters, but because dialogue is how critical thought grows. And if you know someone who still believes that truth is worth seeking, share this video with them. Because the more minds that awaken, the stronger this quiet revolution becomes. Stay curious, stay awake, and above all, keep thinking.